Is the Bible a book of history? Is the Bible a book of myth? Lots of great questions that we will unpack in this conversation. And I think a great person, an expert, you could say, to help us walk through some of these topics, history and archaeology and more, I have with me Dr. Titus Kennedy. He is the author of this book right here. Archaeology and the People of the Bible, exploring the evidence for the historical existence of Bible characters. Dr. Kennedy, thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us today.
Hey, thank you for having me on your show, Nate.
I'm really excited. And so as we go and we talk about those things, the difference between history and myth, we'll talk a little bit about archaeology broadly, what it can show, what it can't show, and so on. But before we get there, tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm an archaeologist, a practicing field archaeologist, which means that I do go out into the field and excavate sites and do surveys rather than just simply teaching or reading and writing. And I love doing that, but I also think it's just essential to being an archaeologist to actually go out there in the field and understand firsthand, experientially, what is happening and how archaeology functions. Education wise, did my bachelor's at Biola University, and that's when I got my intro classes to archaeology. First started taking courses in archaeology. First dig was my freshman year of college, and then I decided I wanted to keep going on, and I did a master's in Near Eastern archaeology from University of Toronto, and that's when I also started to dig in the Middle East. And after that, did a research internship and some adjunct teaching, and I did a second master's and a doctorate in biblical archaeology at the University of South Africa. And eventually, I was able to start doing my own projects, getting permits to do surveys and excavations. And so now I do some teaching half time, universities and seminaries over the past several years, and write some books and articles. I'm editor of a journal on Near Eastern archaeology,
Mm,
and I'm out in the field every year.
mm. And I'm a little bit familiar with your work. I have another book with me called Unearthing the Bible. So, hey, a little two for one there. So, I thank you for your work and your ministry and all that you do for the kingdom. And so, let's talk a little bit about that distinction, um, history and myth. Can you talk about when we define those things and we talk about these different areas, how do you look at something as a work of history versus something as a work of myth?
Yeah, great question, because this often comes up in discussions about the Bible and whether or not the Bible is historically reliable. And it's very popular in society to look at the Bible as a myth, but people may not even really have a good idea of what a myth is, what it isn't, and other distinctive categories like legend and, of course, history. So, a myth is going to be this story from ancient times associated with a specific group of people that has elements in it like supernatural beings, but it's trying to tell a story that solidifies cultural ideas about a specific society. And so its intent isn't really to tell the exact history. It's to give values to a culture and guide them. But even more importantly, the distinction has to do with historical elements that are there and that are lacking. So in a myth, you can have historical elements like historical context and setting. That is, places can be real, and the general group of people can be real. Whereas if it's history that we're looking at, then everything should be real. Everything should be true and accurate, setting aside what biases or propaganda might be. all the people should be real as well as the places and the events. And then there's a third category that's kind of in between the two, and that is legend. So legend is a maybe popular story, popular within a group of people or a nation that is considered to be true, and yet it's not verified. That is, we don't have the evidence that demonstrates that it's true. So that's slightly different than myth as well. I think giving a couple examples will be helpful to people. So often this comes up in discussions about the Bible and about archaeological evidence for the Bible, and people will say, all right, that's interesting. You showed ancient Jerusalem from the time of Abraham and from the time of David and Hezekiah and so forth, and the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar. And yes, that's real. It's a real place, and there's even some destruction evidence from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But that doesn't mean that those people mentioned in the Bible are real, and that the events that they're associated with are. And they might say, look at an example like in the Spider-Man comics. It's set in New York City. We see real buildings like the Empire State Building. So all the historical context is legitimate, but there is no Peter Parker, there's no Spider-Man, those aren't real people.
Oh man.
And so they say, look, there's you can do that with the Bible too, and they say, okay, so someone like David could be a mythological character, a fictional character, or Daniel or Belshazzar or something like that, even though the setting is real. If we're gonna go, I think a more appropriate comparison to the Bible, though, is the Iliad, or a contrast, really, because this is written in ancient times, around the 8th century BC. So it's a similar time frame to the Book of Kings. And the Iliad is generally considered not just a amazing piece of literature, but a myth. And no one really argues that it's something other than that. However, there are definitely historical components to it. In fact, that was Heinrich Schliemann's whole objective, was to show that Troy was real and it had been destroyed. And indeed, places like Mycenae and Troy and the Iliad, those are real places. There are many others, actually. And Troy was destroyed, perhaps even at the time and in the historical context of how the Iliad depicts it. But the other details within the story are not verified. In fact, they're uh, the opposite of that. So this is where the mythological component comes in. All the people like Hector and Achilles and Helen and Paris and Priam and Agamemnon, there's absolutely no archaeological evidence for any of those people. We don't see anything about them until maybe 600 years after that time period of Troy, where the Greeks are showing them in artwork and writing their names down. But this is in connection with the poem, not with historical event. So that's more what mythology looks like. Whereas we go to the Bible, and let's say again, talking about the Book of Kings, First and Second Kings, and we see people in there like David, who's attested archaeologically, and Solomon, who we have all sorts of building projects from him, or Hezekiah, who's one of the best attested kings in the Old Testament, and then all these foreign kings that they interact with as well, like Sennacherib, and of course Nebuchadnezzar, and many others. So in that case, we do have the archaeological evidence from the exact time that they lived that demonstrates their existence, their position, some of the events that they were involved in. So that is the distinction between history and myth. And that was a driving force behind me deciding to write this book on the topic of biblical characters that are attested in archaeology.
Mm, mm. That makes a lot of sense, and I do appreciate that distinction. And I know you mentioned Biola. and attending Biola, and I know they have a strong apologetics program, and so I'll move a little bit in that direction. As an apologist, I sometimes we're tempted to want the silver bullet argument. We'll want, oh, this bit of information, this piece of evidence, that's what I need. There we go. I can prove my case. I can argue for this or that position, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure you get some of that in the world of archaeology, people taking evidence and maybe stretching it too far or trying to assert what they're trying to prove, but the evidence just doesn't back it up, so on and so forth. So, can you talk with us as an expert in your field about the field of archaeology broadly, what it can show, what it can't show, what evidence looks like, and what are the ways that you ascertain, all right, hey, this supports this position or this supports that theory. Can you kind of unveil the curtain for a normal person like me? Tell us a little bit more about archaeology itself.
So archaeology can verify historical events that are written in other texts. It can verify that through the physical remains. It can also illuminate or give us better understanding of various time periods, events, places, people, again, by this physical evidence. So it's very useful as a historical source, helping us understand history, helping us discover or learn more about history, and verifying other ancient documents. But what it can't do is it can't do things like prove that miracles happened, or how they did, mechanisms for things like that. So when we're talking about Jesus, for example, and all of his miracles, we can't show through archaeology that, yes, Jesus performed this miracle and that miracle and so forth. Sometimes what we can show is that people believed that he performed miracles. I mean, people, not just Christians and not just records in the New Testament, but we can't reproduce that and we can't demonstrate that. But we can demonstrate he existed, that he was in a certain place and time, that people knew about his teaching and his works, and many of the locations and events and people in the Gospels. We can demonstrate, we can confirm those. But as far as other limitations of archaeology, or where we might get into trouble sometimes, is when people, as you mentioned, may stretch the evidence too far. And this could be in anything from a small situation, a very insignificant point, to something very, very important. It could be taking just some small potsherds and then extrapolating an idea out of that, or maybe an inscription where half of the letters are not visible, and then someone fills them in hypothetically and more or less creates their own translation out of it, and then from that translation they push certain conclusions.
Hmm.
So we have to really be careful not to overstate the evidence or stretch it beyond its limits, or essentially create our own conclusion out of some evidence that doesn't necessarily lead to that conclusion. But there's also an opposite danger, and that is to basically set everything aside archaeologically, or whenever something comes up that appears to be fairly straightforward and clear, even if it's not as definitive as we might not like it, to put that aside and say, oh no, that can't have anything to do with this historical person or event or place. Because I see the same thing happening. There's sensationalism on one side, and there is absolute historical skepticism on the other side, of revisionism. And then both are doing things where they're taking an artifact, or they're taking archaeological evidence, and they are pushing their own conclusions and then using some objects, some artifacts to fill in their argument.
Mm. Opposite extremes and opposite errors, and we want to avoid those. So I again appreciate you outlining that. Now, moving to the book, y'all, there is so much here. I'm just going to go to the table of contents. Um, two parts to the book, part one, part two. Part one goes over Old Testament people, and part two you have people from the New Testament and a lot of characters. And so we're going to talk about a couple of the main ones, like a few of them, but please consider checking out this book. Yes, you mentioned earlier, I believe, Hezekiah, but then there is David. We'll get to him in a moment. There is going through all these Ahaz and Isaiah and Baruch the scribe, and just several others, and then some minor characters as well. Then in the New Testament, you have Herod, you have Jesus of Nazareth. You know, he's pretty important. John the Baptist. Let's see, Peter and Pilate, and all those things. So at the end of this conversation, again, we're going to highlight a few of these of the major figures, but we're not going to touch everything because that's impossible. That would take many hours. And so please consider checking out this book for archaeological evidence and support for the historicity of the Bible. And so I guess let's start with David, if that's okay, because I know scholarship at one point did not believe that maybe David was a real person, historical figure, if I'm remembering correctly. And then it turns out there is historical, archaeological support for his existence. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right what you said. There was, until recent history, a huge amount of skepticism amongst many scholars that David ever existed. So he was being viewed as a mythological king or fictional character, especially by the time of the 1980s and then leading into the 1990s. This was a very common view amongst archaeologists and ancient historians and even quite a few biblical scholars. And the reason was that they cited no archaeological evidence for his existence. So from one standpoint, this is fine. Uh, if we're just looking purely objectively, and their criteria for everything is that we have to have archaeological evidence for someone's existence or an event to consider it to be historically true, irregardless of what ancient texts might say. But this is not actually applied across the board. So more often, the Bible is the one text that is considered to be guilty until proven innocent through archaeology.
Mhm.
But there's even more backstory to this because we've seen the same pattern over the last 150 years or so of different people or even nations that are mentioned in the Bible that scholars were saying, oh, we have no evidence for this. This is fictional. The Bible is historically false. So you had like the Hittite civilization at one point. We had no archaeological evidence for that. And so some scholars were saying these are people made up by the Bible. Of course, no one could ever say that now or for quite a while. You've got Sargon the second, it's a Syrian king from Isaiah chapter 20. That same thing. Oh, Sargon doesn't exist. We've never heard of this person from Neo-Assyrian sources, but he was one of the most powerful kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And then you've got Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, who was acting king in Babylon. Same kind of situation there. He didn't exist. Oh, okay. Now with these new Babylonian and Persian texts, yes, he did. So that continued to happen. There's many examples like this. And so David was just one in a line of this. But 1993, the Tel Dan stele was discovered. It was an Aramean victory monument, probably from King Hazael, who's also mentioned in the Bible. And he talks about how he defeated this king of Israel, king of Judah, and he says, of the house of David. And so from the ninth century BC, from one of the enemies of the Israelites, they are acknowledging not only David's existence, but his position as the founder of the royal dynasty of Israelite kings. And so that changed everything almost immediately. And the vast majority of scholars accepted that. Some pushed back and tried to say this is a forgery, and then more pieces were discovered in subsequent seasons. And the tests, definitively proved it was an authentic artifact from the site, from the excavations. Then others just tried to translate it differently, but it made absolutely no sense in the context because it's talking about kings of Israel and Judah being defeated and then referencing who they are descended from or who their authority is descended from.
Mm.
So, subsequent to that, the Mesha Stele was reevaluated. That also had the phrase House of David from the ninth century BC, from an enemy of Israel. And then David's palace was discovered. And then several sites are being worked on or have been worked on that demonstrate that David ruled over a kingdom with a centralized government from Jerusalem.
Mm. That's incredible. That's incredible. Yeah, and you mentioned the Hittites and others. Let's talk about that double standard for one moment before we go back and talk about other people in your book. You mentioned that double standard that the Bible people assume guilty until proven innocent. Why do people have that standard of the Bible, in your opinion?
I think this goes back to the Enlightenment first. This is really where we see the movement of higher criticism of the Bible begin. So, skepticism towards the Bible that it is just this spiritual mythological text that it doesn't have any real historical value. It's not true. And then that culminated in the 19th century in this higher criticism of the Bible movement. You've got Julius Wellhausen publishing the documentary Hypothesis, although he wasn't the only one involved in this. He's the most well known. And that started to go out to many universities and seminaries. And it became a very popular belief system or worldview uh, bias, we might say, against the Bible that kept building in popularity over the next century or so. And that is really now the standard view among academics. And so they have been trained in the university, in many seminaries, even with the idea, with the bias that the Bible is a mythological book, at least partially, that it is full of religious propaganda and it is not a reliable source of history. And so they're taking those assumptions to the table and saying, yeah, probably this thing that's written about didn't actually happen. It was written centuries and centuries after the time it alleges to be reporting about. And so we're going to just go with the bet that this didn't happen, this person didn't exist, maybe even this place didn't exist at that time until we see really definitive archaeological evidence that shows that it is true.
Hmm. Yeah, going back to, I guess, some of the philosophical presuppositions of the Enlightenment, and I've been studying that a little bit myself. Just some of those figures, yeah, and the assumptions, the naturalistic assumptions they bring to the table. So that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for explaining, because on one hand, it doesn't seem fair, but you go back to the worldview level, it kind of checks out. It does have some explanatory power. Now, going back to your book, you also cover Isaiah. Isaiah is a large book in the Old Testament, prophetic, and it has all of these references, these prophecies to Jesus coming hundreds of years later. And so it's a powerful book. It is a beautiful book, and it's important. It's sometimes called, or it's been called, the fifth gospel of Jesus. So, can you tell us a little bit about some of the archaeology that has come out regarding Isaiah?
Yeah, so quite recently, just several years ago now, a stamp seal of Isaiah was discovered. So this is called a bulla. It's the clay that his ring seal stamped into and left the impression, and they would seal documents with this. So if he wrote a letter to King Hezekiah, he would put his seal on that. And this was discovered in Jerusalem from a layer around 700 BC, which is the time of Isaiah and Hezekiah. And it was discovered nearby another bula of King Hezekiah. So that was our first archaeological evidence of Isaiah, particularly from the time of his existence. So we know he was a real person in Jerusalem in the reign of Hezekiah. We know that he was a prophet because his seal had that title on it as well. And then we have his book, the book of Isaiah, as you mentioned, and it's got all these prophecies in it. And here's where archaeology can contribute a little bit towards things usually outside of the scope of archaeology, like prophecy or fulfilled prophecy. And that is because the Great Isaiah Scroll, which was probably copied in the 4th century BC, got two different labs that radiocarbon tested it to those dates. Uh, it's got all these prophecies about Jesus and things that were fulfilled centuries later. And yet we have the actual parchment scroll from the 4th century BC. And so there's no way that this could be written after the fact, written after those things happen. And so that then becomes very difficult to explain for someone with a purely naturalistic worldview, that there is no supernatural, that miracles don't exist, that divine prophecy cannot happen.
Mm.
That's a huge problem. You know, the book of Daniel, of course, is like this as well. And so the book of Daniel by secular scholars and other skeptics is usually dated to the middle of the 2nd century BC so that it can post date most of the prophecies in Daniel. There are still some that were fulfilled after that and will be, but this is usually how it's seen. Of course, there is a recent study on those manuscripts as well, arguing that the copies that we have are actually composed earlier or written down, recopied earlier, and so causing more issues. And again, factoring into this whole discussion of archaeological evidence for writings that are then fulfilled later on.
Mm. Well said there. Before we get to the New Testament, I'm going to ask you about Jesus and Pilate in just a moment. Before we leave the Old Testament, I want you to mention briefly about the Exodus. I've heard all of my life there's no evidence for the Exodus. There is no evidence of Hebrews in Egypt. And so just that is mythological, that is false, that is fake, that's made up. But then I've also started to hear Frank Turek, another apologist, did this an archaeological tour in Egypt, if I remember correctly, and I'm starting to hear that that might not be true. That there might be evidence that there was this foreign group of people, Hebrews, in Egypt before the Exodus. So before we get to the New Testament, I want to know your thoughts. Is there, in your opinion, evidence that the Exodus narrative may be true? There may be people in Egypt that fit the description, or is that just completely unverified and the critics and the skeptics are right?
Oh, there is a great deal of evidence for the Exodus as it's recorded in the Bible. I've written many articles on this. I address a lot of it in a previous book of mine, the Essential Archaeological Guide to Bible Lands, when you look at the chapters on Egypt. But just briefly, a few things. So, as far as Israelites or Hebrews being in Egypt, one of the most important pieces of evidence comes from something called Papyrus Brooklyn, which gives a list of household servants or slaves in Egypt. And there's about 95 that are preserved on this fragmentary papyrus. 30 of them have Semitic names. All these people, they're foreigners and they're given then new Egyptian names, just like Joseph was. In fact, the same title that Joseph held in the house of Potiphar over the house is also a title found in this text. But then among those Semitic names, there are several biblical Hebrew names found. Shifra is one of the most famous because she's right there at the beginning of Exodus, but there are feminine versions of male names that we see, like Akoba instead of Jacob, or Menahema instead of Menahem, or Asherah instead of Asher. We also have compound names using Eve or Haya's name and David. And then there's even a name that looks just like Hebrew, somebody's name. So that establishes Hebrews living in Egypt prior to the Exodus, even serving as slaves. But then, we have a lot of other material evidence going along with that. We've got a whole argument that can be made for the Pharaoh of the Exodus at the time the Bible places it, which would be about during the reign of Amenhotep II. I think a really strong, comprehensive case. The wandering, so they leave Egypt and then they're wandering in the wilderness. There's these two inscriptions from Soleb that mention the nomads of Yahweh, and that's got to be the Israelites. It's around 1400 BC. But the Israelites were the only people in ancient times who worshiped Yahweh and were associated with Yahweh. Every single inscription from antiquity that mentions Yahweh is either an Israelite inscription or it's referring to the Israelites and their God. So, contrary to what a lot of even scholars say, but definitely sort of out there in pop culture, Yahweh has nothing to do with Canaanites or Edomites. There are zero inscriptions from those cultures that mention Yahweh.
Mm.
And then the Israelites show up in Canaan and there is destruction at certain sites. We could talk about that. And then eventually you start to see the material culture, four-room house, no pig bones, etc. And the Merneptah Stele, which mentions the Israelites in Canaan. So there's a huge case for the Exodus.
Mm. I'm very glad to hear that because I know sometimes you hear stuff going around online and these scholars, I think one of them was Dan McClellan. I don't know if you've heard of him or you might have thoughts of Dan McClellan, but others that will say some of these things. And so I'm glad to hear the evidence that you put forward. Now, moving to the New Testament. This used to be much more popular at one point, this Jesus mythicism. Jesus was not real. He was made up. He's an invention. And I know it's ridiculous. I know it's not as popular these days, but depending on how far you dig into the dark corners of the internet, you will still occasionally find the random person that will say Jesus never existed. He was made up. So just humor me for just one moment. What is the historical and archaeological evidence for the existence of Jesus?
That's such an important question. And what you said, it's permeated pop culture too. So even though scholars would not say Jesus didn't exist, a lot of people in the general public still say this. And there are these Jesus mythicists out there still writing books and making documentaries. So what's the evidence for Jesus? Well, we have several writers from the first and second century who mention Jesus or call him by his title Christ, and they discuss various aspects of his life from his birth to his time in Egypt to miracles to proclaiming himself God to having disciples to his trial, crucifixion, reports of the resurrection, Christians still worshiping him after he's gone. So there's a lot from these ancient historical sources. In fact, five of the sources were written by people who lived in the first century and who were not Christians. Now, some of them wrote in the second century, early second century, but they lived in the first century as well. And that would be Josephus and Serapion, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Suetonius. But we have more than just these historical manuscripts. We have some archaeological evidence for Jesus as well, like on the James ossuary, this inscription that names Jesus and connects him to his brother James and Joseph. This was a first century burial box from Jerusalem prior to 70 AD. It's gone through all sorts of testing and analysis. It's authentic. And statistical studies suggest that there would have been less than two people who were named Jesus who had a brother named James who had a father named Joseph in Jerusalem in the first century. So it's almost absolute that it's him. And of course, his association with James was well known. We see this in Josephus, who calls James the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. James was the leader of the Jerusalem church. It makes sense he's got an inscribed ossuary because he's somebody of status. If we go to the title Christ, there was a discovery made in Alexandria, Egypt, in the harbor there. There's a ceramic cup of the first century with a Greek inscription on it. And it says, through Christ the magician. And this is because the Egyptians at that time were all about magic. And they believed that they could harness the power of powerful people or magicians. And they thought of Jesus as a magician. In fact, we go to the Egyptian magical papyri, and one of the formulas for casting out demons is to invoke the name of Jesus, God of the Hebrews. We see the same thing in Acts in Ephesus, where the seven sons of Sceva attempt this. So they thought that they could do some religious ritual, probably using this cup, and harness Jesus's power because they had heard about his miracles and they considered him a great magician. In fact, this is how Celsus in the second century depicts Jesus, a magician who learned how to do magic in Egypt and then went back to Judea. So we've got his title, we've got his name, we've got aspects of his life. In Rome at the Palatine Hill, there's the earliest depiction of the crucifixion called the Alexamenos graffito. Again, not made by Christians. It's actually mocking Jesus and Christianity, but it dates to around 100 AD, possibly slightly earlier, possibly a little later, but approximately there. And they show Jesus on the cross with the head of a donkey and a Christian worshiping him. But they knew about the crucifixion. They're not saying it didn't happen. They think it's ridiculous, which Paul tells us the same thing, that the crucifixion was to the Jews a stumbling block and to the Greeks or the Hellenistic mind uh, a ridiculous idea, a foolishness, he says. So that that connects really well with what Paul says and what the archaeological evidence shows. And we could go on with other finds as well, but those I think really demonstrate the historical existence of Jesus. And if you dig into those, you can see how we could almost reconstruct the major aspects of his life just from the non-Christian or non-New Testament sources.
Hmm. I want to reiterate what you've just said. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I'm a believer. I think very highly of those gospels. But even if you take those away, you can still verify much of Jesus's life from external sources. So I think that's very powerful and well said. And all right, so you teach well and you explain things clearly. So I could talk for about 5 hours and just have you go one after the other, all these people. But also, I do want people to buy your book. So at some point, I'm going to have to stop and just say, hey, so much more here. Please go check it out. So I'll ask for one more. I'll ask about Pilate. Pilate's major figure in the story, the life of Jesus, at that stage of his life. And so the last person I'll ask about is Pilate. What is the archaeological evidence for the existence of Pilate?
So Pilate, in some ways similar to Jesus, we have both historical references or historical manuscripts from antiquity that attest to him and discuss some of his life, as well as actual artifacts. In fact, at least one artifact that he himself was involved in commissioning. So Pilate is discussed by Josephus, which is not going to be a surprise to anybody who's familiar with Josephus, but he is also named by Philo of Alexandria and then Tacitus as well. In fact, from these sources, we can see that Pilate was indeed involved in the trial of Jesus. But as far as archaeological evidence, there's quite a bit, considering especially that he was just a provincial governor, and his type of province was an imperial province, which means that he actually had a lower rank and it was directly connected to the emperor, whereas senatorial provinces, those governors, had a higher status. So in 1961, at the site of Caesarea Maritima on the coast, it was the Roman capital of the province of Judea. They found in the theater this stone with a Latin inscription. It had been a monument set up in honor of Tiberius, the emperor, and it was probably dedicating a temple or something like that. And it has Pilate's name and title on it as the one who is dedicating this to Tiberius. So it says Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. And this made headlines, of course, when it was first discovered. It was the earliest archaeological evidence found for Pilate. But interesting thing is that there was actually another artifact attesting to Pilate that was found before this, but it was never cleaned and analyzed. So it was this ring that was discovered at Herodium. It was a copper alloy ring. And while the Pilate stone was inscribed in Latin, this was inscribed in Greek, and it has his name Pilato on it, which is exactly how his name is spelled in the New Testament, in the Greek New Testament.
Mm.
And this was probably not the ring of Pilate himself, but somebody in his administration. So they use this for official duties to stamp things in the name of Pilate. But again, attests to his existence there in Judea. There's a third inscription that was found in Italy, but it's lost now, and it may attest to Pilate when he went back to Italy after his time as governor. But we also have coins that Pilate issued when he was prefect of Judea. And while these don't have his name on it because he didn't have the authority to do that, they have the name of the emperor. We do know that these were coins issued by Pilate. So he's very well substantiated by archaeology and ancient historical manuscripts.
Mm. I love that. That's important because we'll often talk about faith, and there are different definitions of faith. But one term I like to use is reasonable belief. It's something that you can't prove definitively, but you have good reasons to believe it in the first place. And so when we look at what's talked about in the Bible, there are some things that we do take on faith, but archaeology and history steps in to lead us to the conclusion that it is reasonable to believe in what Christianity claims. And you have done a wonderful job of outlining the historicity, the archaeological support for these various figures. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Kennedy, and your expertise and all that you do for the kingdom. And so before I let you go, real quick, if someone wants to learn more about you, see what you're doing, what you're up to, maybe your next book that comes out after this one, where can they go?
Go to Discovery Institute's website, discovery.org, and we've got some information about archaeology and my work there. And we'll be launching a separate page or sub page just on archaeology quite soon. So there will be quite a few resources there. And whenever new discoveries are made or new publications come out, then we'll have those posted online.
Wonderful. The author of the book, Archaeology and the People of the Bible, exploring the evidence for the historical existence of Bible characters. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for talking with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, y'all. Nate Williams, director of the Apologetics Resource Center. If you like this video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel or the podcast. That would be a blessing to the ministry. But until next time, God bless, and I'll talk with you later.